Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK, and in this special episode we're talking about antisemitism and supporting the Jewish community in comms. It's a topic we last covered in a PRWeek UK podcast 5 years ago. And sadly, many signs suggest antisemitism in the UK has been on the rise, especially after the terrorist attack in Israel on 7th of October 2023 and subsequent events in Gaza. Home Office figures show hate crime targeted at Jewish people in England and Wales more than doubled in the year to March 2024. In recent days, of course, the fatal attack on a synagogue in Greater Manchester on the 2nd of October, the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, has put the issue into sharper focus. Our guests today are all Jewish leaders of PR agencies: David Fraser, founder of Ready 10 and Ready Media Group; Mandy Sharp, CEO of Tin Man Communications; and Barry Frankfurt, MD of Creative and Commercial. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I know it's a difficult thing to talk about in many ways and a challenging topic, but I'm really pleased that you're all able to join me and talk about it. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
So first off, I'd like to ask you all to kind of discuss how the events of the last 2 years have affected you, I guess, personally, and how you've seen it manifested in a work context. I know that's a big topic, but it would be good to sort of just discuss things from your own perspectives, really. David, would you like to start?
Sure. John, thank you. Thanks for having this on, and thank you for talking about this subject on the podcast. I wish I had better news and a better answer to give you. I did that podcast 5 years ago, and we did talk about the rise of anti-Semitism, but it was more about how kind of public figures, we referred to some public figures and the general rise. I think what's happened and the difference since is how this has become intensely personal for almost every Jewish person in the UK. It is a real thing to me, as it is to everyone else. My own story, which is not dissimilar to many others, is I'm the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. My great-grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, and that means it's extremely real to me. Anti-Semitism and Jew hate is extremely real to me, as it is to lots of people. But it's always been a semi-comfortable experience, I would say, being a Jew in this country, with the odd thing happening, but actually being able to generally go about our lives. That did change on October the 7th. It had the most profound effect on me, as it did on many people. And I think people need to realise, first of all, how small a community we are. And that meant that almost everybody had some connection with what happened in Israel on that day. Perhaps they knew someone or they knew the areas or so on. And the second part is the connection that people have with Israel, because that country is a safe haven for people following the Holocaust. What that meant was that day it left a lot of people with trauma, whether they were there or not, because of the deep connections that lie. In a work context since then, it can be difficult. I think things come up all the time that didn't before. The thing that I'm sure we'll talk about is the big silences that happen. More microaggressions, I would say, than ever, and sometimes very clear instances of anti-Semitism that have happened in a work context. So that's quite a long answer to say not great.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. Mandy, how about you? Have you had similar experiences?
Yeah, I think the world changed for Jews across the world, literally, on October the 7th. I think it's very hard for people who aren't Jewish to understand the impact that it has on Jews, whether we are very religious, whether we're just sort of Jewish and practicing it in a social kind of family environment. You know, there are lots of different levels of feeling Jewish. But I think David's right. I think I felt the world change for us. I think I think David and I both have a luxury of running businesses. So we're in a much safer haven in a work environment. And that makes a big difference, because it's very unlikely for somebody to be openly anti-Semitic in front of their boss, me. You know, it's a different level of kind of interaction. I worry about maybe more junior people in the industry who are not running businesses, who feel nervous to speak, nervous to share that they're Jewish, nervous to talk about it, don't know what to say when things come up in the news. You know, we are working with the news all the time, and that's some of the feedback that I get. Like, we're so close to the news in our job that it's really hard on a day-to-day basis, and conversations about news are happening in the office all day long, because that's the nature of our industry. And I think a lot of people feel they just can't talk about it. They can't talk about stuff. They can't talk about how they feel because they're scared of the responses and how uncomfortable those responses will make them feel. I haven't seen lots of, anti-Semitic things or instances happen in my business, but I'm not likely to. So I've asked the Jewish people that are in the business, of which there's only 5 Jewish people in my business out of 55 people. And actually, they've had very positive experiences, thank God. Probably because I'm Jewish and I run the business, and it's, we're an agency that is very, inclusive, etc. And we've always made sure we've been that way. But it's a different place now. It's a different place, and people are scared. They feel very fearful. They feel uncomfortable a lot of the time. I mean, David, you've got loads of feedback from, your LinkedIn posts, so you can talk about some of those. But I think it's just depressing, and I feel so disappointed with the world. That's, I think, my emotional feeling is disappointment in how the world has handled the situation for Jewish people.
Yeah, and Barry, have you sort of had a similar experience?
I'm in a very different position as much as I am very openly Jewish. I wear a kippah, skull cap on my head all the time, so I'm easily identifiable. And for good and for bad, my work and personal life have a significant overlap. And as much of the work that we do at the agency is in and around the Jewish community, advocacy, campaigns, etc. So I've seen it from perhaps like the other side of the fence from a work point of view. And I would say that, yes, the 5 years have been very strange to be Jewish, past 5 years. Post-Corbyn, I think everything changed. October 7th, everything changed again. And last Thursday, Yom Kippur, everything changed once more. Well, growing up in the UK, I've lived here all my life, I cannot remember ever once having a conversation around our dinner table about whether it was safe to be Jewish in the UK and London. Never. We've had those conversations repeatedly around tables with friends, family. That's the environment our children are growing up in now. The conversation is completely different. And last Thursday, the attack in Greater Manchester was such an outlier and such a shock, because it's the first time in any of our memory, first time in over 50 years, that someone has been murdered in the UK because they are Jewish, which is both a shocking and outstanding statistic. It is such a wake-up call that we've never had to face this before. And now this is the reality we are confronting, is that, okay, it's now happened. And if it's happened once, it can happen again. And that's the personal side of it. And being exposed to anti-Semitism, yes, the type of anti-Semitism that perhaps doesn't really register, but I've been exposed to it, my family's been exposed to it. My 15-year-old daughter came back from Sabrina Carpenter concert at Hyde Park in tears because, as a young Jewish girl, 2 men went up to her and started shouting that she was a genocidal maniac at her. My son walks to synagogue, aged 17, and people are shouting "Free Palestine" at him because he's Jewish. It's those sorts of things are happening, and they're making life uncomfortable. In the workplace, I'm also very lucky. As Mandy said, people are not likely to be openly anti-Semitic in front of their boss. But we've seen it from the other side. We've looked at running campaigns where we've needed people who would have previously happily been involved as both suppliers or maybe as people to front the campaign, who have said, no, this isn't the right time to be associated with a campaign which is all about the Jewish community. It doesn't sit well with us at the moment. And it's very depressing. And it's something that we've had to really learn to come to terms with since October the 7th.
Thank you for sharing that. Why do you think there is that hesitancy to be involved in these sorts of campaigns to support the community?
I think there is such an overlap between the perception of what the Jewish community is and what's happening in Israel that people who don't understand or don't want to understand find it a lot easier just to say, I'm not getting involved in that, rather than to try and sort of justify it, well, I'm actually supporting a Jewish community, it's nothing to do with Israel, or please don't take this as my politics, but. And I think that is that is something that, there was an excellent post last week by the editor of the Jewish News, Richard Frere, where he spoke about how his newspaper, the Jewish News in the UK, had not been able to secure supply to build their website because of what the supply company who agreed to put down to the type of cultural differences that his staff would not be able to manage with, i.e. working on a Jewish website, Jewish community website at this time. I strongly recommend that you read Richard's post, because that's the sort of thing which I think people within the community and within our space within the community are having to put up with and tolerate at the moment.
Is that something, Mandy and David, that you've noticed sort of echoes of that in a sort of professional context in any way? I appreciate the fact that you run your own agencies, your staff aren't going to express these things to you would have thought, but do you think in the wider sector there are echoes of this?
I mean, that's shocking. I haven't had instances like that. That is, just so depressing. I haven't really got examples like that, to be honest. I don't know whether you have, David, where you've seen it. I mean, my team, the things that they get upset about, I think, is when they see colleagues posting about, stuff happening in Gaza that is incorrect, makes them feel uncomfortable. They sit next to them at work and then they go home and post stuff that's basically anti-Semitic. That's a problem for them. But I haven't had an incident where, like Barry's example, because that is not good. Not good at all.
I haven't had specific examples, but I think to Mandy's point and Barry's point about how we wouldn't necessarily experience overt anti-Semitism because we run our businesses, I think the same extends to things like suppliers. And there is a difference. And I'll be very honest, there's clearly a difference between our experiences amongst the three of us because of the position we're in and what other people in the industry are finding, because the comments that I got and the feedback that I got from social media indicates our individual experiences are not necessarily reflected. I can't tell if a supplier has ever refused to work with us or shied away from working with us because of those reasons, because I suspect if that had happened, and I'm not saying it has, but if it had happened, they probably wouldn't have been as overt about it. What I can say, and this is one of the themes, is the silence on certain things is one of the key issues, and the silence on people's failure to speak out, correct things that they see, showing gratitude is deeply hurtful to people. And that definitely is palpable amongst a few other things, which I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yeah, it would be good, David, to maybe reflect on some of the comments that you've received when you posted about coming on this podcast on LinkedIn. What other things are people saying?
Yeah, so I put a post out 24 hours ago saying I was coming on this podcast and I wanted to hear from people about their experiences from Jewish colleagues in the industry, but also I wanted to understand from non-Jewish colleagues who work with Jewish people what their perspectives were. I got a very, very good reaction. I think, interestingly, almost nothing on LinkedIn that could be publicly seen. So I only had one or two comments that other people could see. I did, however, receive 24 direct messages. That's interesting in itself. Almost all of them asked to remain anonymous. And actually, the feedback, the kind of comments I'm going to give will all be anonymized. But many people asked for their comments to be anonymous. So I think people can read into that various things. 2/3 were from Jewish people, 1/3 were from non-Jewish colleagues. So hopefully it's representative of a number of views. There were some key themes that came up from how people are feeling. And I should say I had 7,000 words in total because I put it all into a Word document. It was a hell of a lot. People were not just sending one line. People were sending really, really kind of deeply thought through comments on this. Silence. It was one of the main ones which I've talked about. So people really feel that other people's response is one of silence. One person said, "I just wish more people would check in. A simple hope you're okay would go a long way in making us feel seen." Someone else said, "I now keep my Jewishness hidden in all circumstances until I know for sure it's safe to reveal it." Many people were saying that they just haven't heard from a lot of colleagues. A non-Jewish colleague said, put simply, "I do not believe that anti-Semitism is taken as seriously as other forms of discrimination." There was other key themes. So many people were frustrated on the conflation between being Jewish and what is going on in Israel at the moment. A non-Jewish colleague said this, which I thought was really interesting. The fashionable response is to say it's not anti-Semitic to criticise a sovereign state. Whilst that is true, it does have a blind spot, and that's that most Jews view Israel's existence as a source of comfort and safety, which is the point, really. I think everybody's talked about nuance a hell of a lot the last couple of years, but nothing particularly when it comes to this matter, this region, is binary. It really isn't. The other thing, which this took me completely by surprise, because I guess I don't have this so much in our business because we're a small business, DEI departments got a real kicking from people, I have to say, for just not recognising this as an issue from everybody across the board, mainly people in bigger businesses. So one person said the DEI movement completely failed and fails the Jewish community. Seeing anti-Semitism baked into social justice and anti-racism circles has been the biggest shock, was what one person said. Someone else said, I think one colleague has messaged me, but not a single word from the DEI team, who absolutely know I'm Jewish. And I've heard anecdotally from more than one person that people at big firms, they would have got some emails after the synagogue attacks, but in a very generic way. One person reported being told that the company wanted to be fair to quote unquote all sides in their response to it. And so, look, they are the sort of main themes that are coming from it, but it wasn't positive reading. Apart from, it was heartening to see so many non-Jewish people express their support and their understanding of the issues. So maybe a glimmer of hope there.
I think across all workplaces and across society, the situation in Israel and the way it's treated, handled, responded to here and in other places has allowed anti-Semitism to essentially operate in plain sight. You have a very simple situation whereby you can say something about Israel, but you can solely target it at your one Jewish follower on social media or your one Jewish colleague. And yes, you are making a comment about Israel, and Israel is as open to comment as any other country in the world. But if the target of that comment is your Jewish friend, your Jewish colleague, then it really does begin to sort of tip over into something which is going to be considered, as David said before, a microaggression or some level of anti-Semitism. You know, it's like, as I said, when my son is walking down the street and someone shouts Free Palestine because he's walking to synagogue, that's not about Free Palestine anymore. It's about how do you make life unpleasant for a 17-year-old boy in northwest London. And I think that part of the issue that we have is that there's not a good enough understanding of, as David just said, the identity that exists within Jewish people, the vast majority in this country, that sort of coexists with some kind of relationship to Israel. And that is a problem, because if people don't understand that, don't appreciate that, it will make it A, much harder to stop being anti-Semitic, and B, much harder for them to see their anti-Semitism.
It is shocking, isn't it? Mandy, what are your thoughts on the feedback here? Is it something that resonates with you too?
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. Yeah, I'm quite impressed with the number of non-Jews that have taken the time to write to you, though, David. I think that's something. I mean, after the Manchester incident, I had a grand total of 2 messages from non-Jewish people in my life, of which both happened to be previous colleagues. We did talk about it at work, and obviously I'm in a safe environment. The people I work with at the senior level I've worked with for years, they're very supportive, very understanding, very open-minded, very fair, etc. So it was fine. But the lack of messages that I had, and that most Jewish people I've spoken to, is quite shocking, I think. I just don't think it resonates with people. You know, it's just a different connection. I mean, I asked some of my Jewish team about, you know, some of their feelings, etc. And I think it's the misunderstanding and the misplaced assumptions that's the biggest issue. And that's the theme that comes up quite a lot. Being British and Jewish doesn't mean I must answer for the actions of a government thousands of miles away or be put in a position to have to defend. Not all Jews are blind to the suffering of others. We can hold compassion and fear at the same time. You know, it's those kind of comments. It's just, I think people just have to understand the sensitivities, and that you don't have to always have goodies and baddies. There is grey in there, and the problem with social media is that it's very, very easy to just, because it's such a complicated situation, it's much easier to just pick a side quickly. And that's the problem. And I think it's what Barry said, this country has just let this anti-Semitism just happen in front of our eyes. I mean, literally yesterday I watched Sky News. I think it was the Manchester mayor who was interviewed, and he was saying that, he said something like, I don't think it's my place or the government's place to decide whether Kneecap should be performing at the Manchester Academy later in November. I mean, to me, I just can't believe some of the stuff I see on the news. I just find that unbelievably shocking. It's like, what do they expect? And then today there's a news report from the BBC talking about the rise of, religious hate crimes. 25% increase over the last year, mainly driven by a rise in hate crimes to Jews. This was obviously going to happen. So when Manchester happened, most Jewish people that I spoke to were shocked and sad, but not surprised. And that is so sad. They just weren't that surprised. They were like, it was always going to happen.
I think that's a really important point. Nobody was surprised whatsoever. And I think non-Jewish people will be surprised at hearing that. And when you do have conversations and explain what it's like to be a Jew in this country, people are shocked. So all of us will have not blinked twice throughout our lives at going into a synagogue with security on the door. That has always happened forever. You can't just walk into a synagogue on a Saturday morning. You've never been able to. All of us will either have done or will know someone in our family that does a security patrol shift around the Jewish holidays or Saturday mornings outside their synagogue. I did one on Wednesday night, 10 hours before someone in Manchester did exactly the same thing and got murdered whilst they were doing that. Our kids who go to Jewish schools, again, have to go through high-rise gates, have to practice terrorist drills, where they have to go through what might happen in the worst-case scenario. And so when it happened on Thursday, it wasn't a shock to people because we felt this was coming. And so whilst there is sadness, there is also, I think it's fair to say, a lot of anger. A lot of anger at institutions in this country, many people angry at the government. But on small individual levels, I'm also angry at people for allowing this environment where people say small things, do small things, and they eventually, I want to make sure I say this right, because clearly I'm not accusing anybody who might say one thing or the other of carrying this out, but it all breeds an environment where it's extremely hostile, and people who have this kind of murderous intent then go on to do the kind of things that they're doing, if that makes sense.
There's a report from the JPR, the Jewish Policy Research Organisation, that came out earlier this week. And the numbers are staggering because they are able to give a direct comparison. And just taking, not even, I suppose, what you call sort of full-on anti-Semitism, but what people describe as being the hostile comments, the microaggressions, the small stuff, if you like. 45% of Jews in this country say they currently experience them. That's up from 7% before October the 7th. And I think what's chilling is, even with everything that's gone on, the spike in anti-Semitism has been caused by an event which started with the murder of Jews. And that's what I think is frightening people, because what's become apparent is that anti-Semitism, if you like, is the yeah but of racism or discrimination. Whenever you say anything about anti-Semitism, there's always a yeah but. Even last week, after the Greater Manchester murders, you could turn on your BBC, Sky, Channel 4, social media, and serious commentators with serious voices were asking people, yeah, but how much is this to do with what's happening in Israel? And you just would not get that with any other. After the Manchester Arena bombing, there was no one saying, yeah, but how much do we have to blame the victims because of what's happening elsewhere? It just doesn't happen. And I'm not talking about on the periphery now, we're talking about in the mainstream. Trevor Phillips asked Tracy Nathan this on Sky News. Richard Bacon put on his social media, yes, but what about all the things Netanyahu's doing in Israel? This is what's happening. We, the Jewish community, have had to tolerate sort of this but on everything. And I think for it to change and for the attitude towards the Jewish community to change, when the community says we're under attack or this is anti-Semitism, it should be met without but anything. It's okay, and how are we going to deal with this? And we're not there yet. As a society, as a workplace, we're not there yet. And if we are genuine as a society about resolving the anti-Semitism issue, and I use that word genuine loosely, if we are genuine about it, then we have to show that we're prepared to actually address anti-Semitism in a vacuum and say, okay, we're not going to compare it to anything else. We're not going to look at what's happening elsewhere. We're going to look at the experience of British Jews in society, in workplace, in media, in whatever, and we're going to see how we can make that better. Otherwise, it won't change and it'll probably get worse.
Obviously, you were talking about institutions there. It might be good to reflect on the institutions in our industry. There were at least a couple of statements I noticed from some of the trade bodies, organisations like People Like Us, for example, that PRWeek works with on the recent Pay Gaps project. Is there a sense that, at least among some, there is a bit more recognition than there was, or do you feel that there's still a long way to go in our sector for people to properly understand and act appropriately in these times?
I don't want to embarrass Shiraz from People Like Us, who's not on this podcast, but I have to give him his credit. When I returned from synagogue on Thursday night and turned my phone on, there was a text message from him expressing his horror and sorrow at what had happened and kind of reaching out and offering support. So that was extremely appreciated and heartening. And look, evidence that there's some good work being done out there and understanding on these issues from institutions. Apart from that and the PRCA comment that you refer to, I haven't seen a great deal of work being done on this. The other thing, I'm not an institution, but for 2 years I have been talking about this and been saying to people, I can point people in the right direction for resources. I can try and clarify things that people may not be sure about, because we know, particularly from the comments, that one thing people are very worried about is saying the wrong thing, which we can talk about. I haven't been asked. I've put a lot out there. I haven't been asked for very much help. So my answer to that would be there's a bit being done, but clearly not enough. And that's backed up in the comments that people sent to us.
It's another thing for people, isn't it, who are not Jewish. It's just, it's what I was saying earlier. It's just, if it's not your world, it's not your world. And therefore, people have to actively go and find out information, and people don't tend to do that. Therefore, they are unfortunately, led by knowledge that isn't always correct. And that's what you're saying, David. You're saying people need to actively go and find out some information, or, just be interested enough to want to say and do the right thing and understand how to do that.
Well, look, maybe we should talk now about this. And I get it. There's this fear. I don't want to say the wrong thing, because that came up quite a lot in the comments. And I totally understand that. What I would say on that is, first of all, don't be defensive, because we all get things wrong. I have said the wrong thing in the last 2 years, for sure, on things. And if someone points it out to me, I'll have a think about it, not be defensive, I would like to think, and correct it. Better to say something and risk saying the wrong thing than not to say something, because the silence is deafening. The other thing to say is a basic show of humanity and sympathy shouldn't really be that difficult. Saying to people, I'm really sorry this has happened to your community. Is there anything I can do? It's a pretty safe thing to say. I don't think anyone's going to go too wrong with that. But ask people. Ask the Jewish people that you work with. Ask them, can you explain this to me? And it's not for them to... Sorry, because I'm going to slightly contradict myself. It's not for them to justify things like the policy of the Israeli government, but it's better to ask a question which they may or may not feel comfortable in asking than just to kind of shoot in the dark. But it's better to talk than not talk, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few, people in my company actually said to me, how does this make you feel? And actually, just having someone ask you that, so you can actually explain how you feel, makes you feel better, actually. It's not a big thing. How do you feel about this? Are you okay? well, no, I'm not okay. I feel like this, and this is why I feel like this. Because what happens is Jews feel the natural need to educate all the time. I find, I don't know if Barry and David, I mean, Barry, you completely do because that's your whole business in a way. But, if someone will give me 5 seconds, I find myself desperately trying to educate people on things that I know that they will think that are incorrect, because I feel like Jews are always naturally trying to prove themselves or why their situation is the way. It's ridiculous, really, but I think we're just born like that, and I think it's got more and more like that. So if someone asks you how you're feeling and will give you 2 minutes to say, well, I feel actually really bad because of this, that and the other, that's just helpful in itself.
Do you find that people generally do sort of really listen and take things on board, or they can be a bit defensive, or that sort of yes buts that we spoke about earlier on? I guess it must depend very much on the person.
I mean, it's difficult for us because they're going to listen. If we're talking about the workplace, people tend to listen to what I'm saying because I'm their boss. So it's a different thing. I don't know how it is for, some of my staff having conversations with other colleagues. I don't know, actually.
Look, okay, let's talk a tiny little bit about Israel because it is relevant. My own opinion is what the Palestinian people are experiencing is horrendous. It's horrible to be a Palestinian in Gaza at the moment. Lots of people feel very strongly on this issue. I find with people that feel strongly on this issue, they're extremely entrenched, and where their views are straying into anti-Semitism, they absolutely refuse to accept it. It's deeply entrenched, and they're actually, when you talk about, are people listening and taking it on board, I have very, very few instances where that is happening. I think people feel that they might be betraying themselves and their principles to let this kind of context in. That is my personal experience. I find where people are perhaps have a more balanced view on it, yes, absolutely. People are listening to it. Where people do have that very firm view, I'm seeing no progress, no acknowledgement that there's nuance, no acknowledgement where things stray over into anti-Semitism, and just absolutely no acceptance of that.
What I would see as the obsession in public discourse with Israel is making it impossible to prevent and protect against anti-Semitism in the UK. And, just to give one example of that, there are people walking through the streets with signs that say "Globalise the Intifada," and people getting killed in Manchester. And there's still the mental gymnastics that take place that say that one cannot be connected to the other. And absolutely they can be connected to each other. It's about visibility, it's about what's permissive and what's permissible. And where we are at the moment is that, and it comes back to the same thing, if you say that is anti-Semitic, you're told that you are preventing legitimate criticism of Israel. But if you look at the outcomes of it, it quite clearly here in the UK has anti-Semitic outcomes. And people have to educate themselves, and we have to educate people. But as David says, if they are so entrenched in that position, ultimately, we saw it this week on the anniversary of October the 7th, people went out on university campuses in this country to glorify the anniversary of the resistance. That happened in our country on October the 7th. And October the 7th was the resistance in that respect. There were 1,200 Jews murdered on October the 7th. It is about Israel, and it's not about Israel. But when you walk around London with Globalise Intifada, you're not helping anyone anywhere else in the world, but you are making life a hell of a lot worse for your friends, families, colleagues in the UK.
The one point I would add to this is I think people need to recognise where they may feel passionately about something, but it's just not appropriate and the timing is wrong. So the big example of the last week has been the Palestine Action protest that took place over the weekend, 3 days after the killings in Manchester. But on an individual level, last Thursday afternoon, 3 hours after this news had broke, I saw somebody in our industry post on social media video of a pro-Palestine protest. And we are not Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu, right? We have a few people following us on social media as individuals. If what we say only has so much reach. And how does that person's Jewish colleagues feel? And how does that person's Jewish clients feel? And how does that person's Jewish people in their orbit feel? Is it really necessary at that point, hours after what has happened, to do things like that? Or is there a better time and place, knowing what hurt it will cause? Or is there a better time and place to do things like that? And every Jewish person will tell you criticism of the Israeli government and what is happening is completely legitimate. But there needs to be more thought, more nuance, more understanding, more sensitivity applied.
And more empathy. I think there just needs to be more empathy. And that, for me, is what is sort of really missing, because I think there are 100% ways that you can hold lots of the views that we may disagree with, and those views are still legitimate. But the expression of them in a non-empathetic way can feel like and can present as though you're crossing significant sort of boundaries between legitimate criticism or legitimate opinion holding and ones that stray into provocative, potentially microaggressive, certainly anti-Semitic actions. And you have to be willing to accept that's part of who you are to make it better. This was one of the things about sort of Jeremy Corbyn. I can't, as he would say, I can't possibly be anti-Semitic. I've fought for my whole life. Yeah. Well, no. If Jewish people are telling you that they're feeling that this is anti-Semitic, then it's worth listening to them and looking inwards and saying, okay, well, how do I hold these views and express them, and at the same time listen to the people who are telling me that they are finding it unacceptable or perhaps even anti-Semitic. And we all have to do that with a whole load of different opinions we might hold. We all have to think about this before we express them, before we print them, before we go, sort of full-blown public with them. And I just feel that with anti-Semitism, that level of empathy doesn't seem to be required. You can say what you want about anything, and it is permissible. And I think for the whole Glastonbury scenario, where you've basically got a crowd of people just chanting along with a singer who's saying things which in any other environment would be deemed as hugely inappropriate and anti-Semitic, and you've got but basically a repeat of the Borat scene, sort of throw the Jew down the well, except it's not comedy, it's actually happening. And there's just a lack of empathy. Like, there were Jewish people in that audience, there are Jewish people at Glastonbury, there are Jewish people watching, and you don't care enough because your political opinions trump other people's feelings, trump other people's experiences, and we won't get past the problem of anti-Semitism until we all step back and say, okay, where do we draw the lines?
I'm conscious that we are running out of time. I know there's a huge amount we all want to say. I would be good, though, to maybe end on a quick point about what sort of final message you'd want to give to our listeners, to the comms industry, when it comes to combating anti-Semitism and being more accommodating and empathetic.
Yeah, so I did want this to be quite practical, I guess, for people listening. And in particular, as we said at the top, Mandy, Barry and myself are people of seniority within the industry and who run our own companies. There's a lot of people in the industry who are more junior, who don't sit in a position where they feel they can do very much. And I know they're feeling very powerless, Jewish colleagues. There's lots of people out there that will help you. Please do, if there's anything that we can do, or you've got a Jewish colleague somewhere or a Jewish mentor, please do be in touch with them. But also non-Jewish colleagues and mentors. There are plenty of people out there. Try, if you can, don't be silent. There's support out there. There's people out there who can support you. To non-Jewish colleagues, I would say, talk to the people that you work with. But also, if you want to understand stuff more formally, there's plenty of organisations out there that can run anti-Semitism training and understanding of these issues. And if you want to send any of us a message after, we can point you in the right direction of these. I think I posted last week about words are important, and I appreciate people getting in touch, but now we need to see action. And that action is people thinking about how they're behaving, changing how they're behaving, changing how they're reacting. And if we just see words and no action, nothing changes. So I would say to everyone, act.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're in the comms industry. We do this for a living. We know the power of our words. We should understand. We should do better, I think, as an industry, being, working with the media as we do. We should be able to understand nuances better, be more sensitive to the things that we say and the way we behave. And I think we have a responsibility to check in and educate. If you don't know and you don't understand, that's absolutely fine, because it's complicated and no one doubts that. And there's always, as Barry's saying, there's always going to be differing opinions. But just think before you speak. And if you're not sure, spend some time to educate yourself.
Can I just jump in to say one more point, because I want Barry to have the last word, because he always talks much more eloquently on these things than me. But I did want to say, this is going out Monday, isn't it? And we've recorded this a few days before. And a lot is changing in the world. And hopefully there is a deal in Israel with the hostages and a ceasefire that will go through and that will continue to happen. What I would say is that doesn't mean this is over. As in, this doesn't mean this ceases to be an issue. This doesn't mean this is going to be necessarily less of an issue. Because 5 years ago, when we did this podcast, none of these things in the last couple of years had happened, and anti-Semitism was still on the rise. So this will continue to be an area that concerns Jewish people for quite a while.
I think we are in a changing world on this. And I think just very practically, something that even myself, who is a very openly Jewish person, I found myself over the past couple of years finding times where I've turned down or turned off parts of my identity because it's just easier that way. And what I would say to people in our industries, in the workplace, is if you've got Jewish colleagues, then the best thing you can do is just establish and ensure that part of their work life does not involve them turning off or down any part of their Jewish identity. Because if that is happening, they are hiding something. They're not being themselves because they are Jewish. And what we have to do is get to a point where, as it's normal to be almost anything else nowadays within the workplace, it needs to be completely normal to be an identifying, proud Jewish person. And if you are employing people, working with people who are not able to be proud, identifying Jewish people, then we are letting those people down. And we will not, I do not believe we will sort of get past this phase of anti-Semitism for as long as Jews are hiding their identities. I think the opposite will happen. More and more Jews will hide their identities to fit in with everyone else. And I think that is not the world that any of us really want to live in, or more importantly, for this purpose, work in.
Thank you all so much for your time and talking about what I'm sure is a difficult thing to talk about, but it's good to have you on and to explain all of those things. I've learnt a lot. I hope our listeners have. So thanks again. And obviously, thank you to everyone for listening. For now, goodbye.